Going to be talking a little bit about the next generation science standards and how they've been adapted to the New York State Science Learning Standards. So today's objectives, we're going to learn how New York State Science Learning Standards impact CTE, share our resources, and identify best practices. We're going to be emulating what real science does, how science is actually practiced in the field. No one teacher should ever feel the need to do this on their own. The Technical Assistance Center is here to provide resources and is prepared to share best practices, in addition to networking with others in the state in the context of integrated academics. Our outcomes today are to improve the practice for integrated academics, increase technical assessment results, and then, of course, with CTE program approval, help to prepare for that external review. So the framework. We have a purpose of benchmarking science education against international standards, and then also to provide a framework for the 3 dimensions of learning. These include science and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, and our disciplinary core ideas. So instead of content driving the instruction, the reverse is going to occur. The methodology now has to drive the content. So practices represent the methodology. Instead of segregated STEM fields of study, connections between subject areas are going to occur. Our cross-cutting concepts are representing the interdisciplinary teaching. So instead of individual topics, the real-world context has to be included. And then our core ideas are going to represent our real-world units of study. Thus far, we have adopted the NGSS by 18 states and the District of Columbia, and then it has been adapted by 15 additional states. So the changes to the process of curriculum alignment. Before, we used to identify the content standards that were met per lesson, and then we would add additional standards if other content areas were included. Today, we have 3 dimensions to identify. So our core ideas align with a broad unit of study in a CTE and science area, our science and engineering practices within that core idea, and then we also identify the interdisciplinary connections for the cross-cutting concepts that pertain to that unit of study. So the State Ed Implementation Roadmap states, in the recent 2015 report, Revisiting the STEM Workforce by the National Science Board, it is stated that the STEM workforce is extensive and critical to innovation and competitiveness, and careers in these fields will only grow in the next decade. So if we were to compare the old standards of the MST learning and the new standards for science learning, we will see that the difference becomes content-driven versus process-driven. We used to use mathematical analysis, inquiry, engineering design to pose questions, seek answers, and develop solutions. But today, we want to model behaviors that scientists engage in as they investigate the natural world and the practices that engineers use. We used to understand the relationships and common themes that connect all our disciplines and apply them to other areas of learning. Today, we want to utilize common themes that are interdependent upon each other. We used to understand and apply scientific concepts and principles and theories pertaining to the physical setting and living environment. But today, we want to provide tools for investigating complex ideas and solving problems. Now, these core ideas are very familiar science disciplines. The change is going to be that we do not call them content, we now call them core ideas. And these actually model themes versus the content. We're going to examine the differences between the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts. The science and engineering practices model what scientists do in the context of their job. They ask questions, define problems, develop and use models, carry out investigations, analyze and interpret data, use math and computational thinking, construct explanations for science, and design solutions for engineering. They engage in argument from evidence and obtain, evaluate, and communicate information. Our cross-cutting concepts, however, Identify the themes, the patterns, cause and effect, scale, proportion, quantity, system models, flows, cycles, conservation for energy, structure and function, stability and change. And you probably will recognize these categories because they align with higher level thinking in Bloom's taxonomy. Now, our new learning standards were designed in collaboration between National Science Teachers Association and Achieve Incorporated. EQUIP is a tri-state collaborative between Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, and they actually represent educators evaluating the quality of instructional products. The questions that were addressed or will be addressed in the EQUIP rubric are my units aligned to NGSS or the New York State Learning Standards? What instructional supports are in place to help my students achieve these goals of the lesson or unit? And then how will I assess student progress during the lesson or unit? These represent a major shift in how we expect students to demonstrate and communicate their understanding of science. Now, the EQUIP rubric has three purposes: to evaluate lessons and units of study, to identify the qualities of instruction under the lens of NGSS, and to refine and improve current instruction through evidence, reasoning, and feedback. It has three categories: alignment to the standards, instructional supports, and then monitoring student progress. When we align to the NGSS, the questions that will be addressed include, will all three dimensions be connected throughout the lesson or unit of study? And will students be truly engaged in the process of learning? For instructional supports, we address phenomena. Phenomena are used to engage students in learning. These phenomena hook students into wondering why or how an event happens. The question that needs to be answered is, does this lesson or unit provide students with authentic opportunities to make sense of their world? These phenomena are mechanisms to drive student learning across all three dimensions. When we monitor student progress, we should identify specific evidence of learning in the lesson unit and provide reasons for how this connects to the rubric. Is this reasoning explicit in the goals of the lesson or unit? How do you plan on measuring the outcomes of the lesson or unit? And how will the connections between prior learning and new learning be reinforced? So the three-dimensional learning EQUIP rubric includes the alignment between CTE and science. And this is very evident. If you look at your CTE programs and science programs, the only difference is between providing opportunities to develop and use practices that align with industry standards versus the three dimensions of the science standards. Both of them are going to help students develop proficiency on performance expectations. Both will engage students in authentic and meaningful scenarios. Both will develop deeper understanding by identifying and building on students' prior knowledge. Both adjust support over time so that students are increasingly responsible for making sense of phenomena. Both of them will provide multiple opportunities for students to demonstrate performance of practices connected with their understanding and receive feedback. Now, the STEM and STEAM initiatives at the state and national levels are really synonymous with integrated academics into CTE. Teachers have been encouraged to teach STEM disciplines simultaneously with the onset of the MST learning standards. Interdisciplinary teaching was encouraged well before STEM became the acronym of choice. And when academics are taught in conjunction with CTE programs, it is really STEM on steroids. We accept today that authentic examples provide multiple opportunities to solidify learning, and student engagement is the key to information remaining in long-term memory. So why the co-teaching model? We want to engage students in a real-world context where they work in teams in the real world. We want to prepare students for the technical assessments. We also want to align the CTE content with the new learning standards in preparation for the program approval and reapproval.
All right, now let's shift gears just a little bit and discuss how inquiry-based learning and as it relates to science. So just a little quote to get us started with this section of the presentation. Learning science is something students do, not something that is taught to them or done to them. So with that being said, a couple of general thoughts about inquiry-based learning through science. First off, science subject matter should be taught through inquiry. True inquiry occurs when students generate and pursue their own questions. So when we think of inquiry-based learning, we're basically getting it from the point where the instructors and the teachers are feeding a lot of information to the students, where, for example, through the science and engineering practices, students will learn to plan and conduct investigations individually and collaboratively to produce data to serve as a basis for evidence and in the design. They're going to decide on the different precision factors as far as data. So what are the number of trials, the cost, the risk, the time, and then they're going to refine that design accordingly and make adjustments where needed. Inquiry teaching occurs easily through the use of hands-on or kit-based instructional materials, as we all know through our project and problem-based learning skills that we teach in CTE. So the cross-cutting concepts, models, using physical models, mathematical models, computer models, those can all be used to simulate systems and interaction, which are going to trigger more inquiry among the students and learners. Student engagement in hands-on activities guarantees that inquiry teaching and learning are occurring with the students. We can actually see the light bulb go off whenever students are investigating and inquiring at a deeper level. And inquiry can be taught without attention to the specific subject matter. Best practices for inquiry-based learning. Most of us learn best through personal experience and by connecting new ideas to what we already know. For example, with disciplinary core ideas, humans depend on the living world for the resources and other benefits provided by biodiversity. But human activity is also having adverse impacts on biodiversity through overpopulation, overexploitation, habitat deconstruction, pollution, introduction of invasive species, and climate change. Thus, sustaining biodiversity so the ecosystem functioning and productivity are maintained is essential to supporting and enhancing life on Earth. Students must have a chance to move from concrete to more abstract ideas. So I think in education a lot of time is that our students are trained from an early age that there is only one answer to any given question. However, through inquiry-based learning, this opens up the opportunity for students to question what they think might be the one set answer and come up with other answers, as long as they can provide that evidence to explain why they're getting to that certain endpoint that they've reached. Inquiry is well documented as an effective tool in science instruction, and many effective teaching strategies are core elements of inquiry. So what are some essential features of inquiry? So we're going to discuss 5. Learners are engaged by scientifically oriented questions, so we're giving them prompting questions to get their minds thinking. Learners are then going to give priority to evidence, which allows them to develop and evaluate explanations. So why is the phenomenon occurring and what justifies that? Learners then formulate those explanations from the evidence that they're witnessing, and they address it scientifically to oriented questions. Learners connect explanations to the scientific knowledge, so we've already set the foundations for them as the instructors, and they can look back on that prior knowledge through the spiraling and scaffolding process, and they can make connections and understand and explain why certain things are happening. Learners communicate and justify the proposed explanations. A lot of that is done through collaborative activity with their peers and their instructors. And so, the chart that you see before you, essential features of classroom inquiry and their variations. So the overall goal when you're discussing inquiry-based learning is you want it to go from a teacher-directed model to more of a learner self-directed model. So if you look at the chart, categories 1 through 5, our end goal is to strive for all of our learners to reach to the column on the far right, being column D. So we want the students, we want the learners to pose questions. We want them to determine what constitutes the evidence, and they want to collect it in the appropriate manner. We want them to then explain why they're finding the phenomena that they are and why that phenomena is happening through summarizing that evidence. And then the students are going to then take that data, they're going to examine it independently, and they're going to form links to explanations of why certain things are happening. And then they'll find a logical argument and way to communicate what the phenomena is, what the outcome is that they've reached, and then they'll be able to discuss those explanations with their peers and with others around them. So what are some benefits of inquiry? It's basically going to bring real-world situations into the classroom. So again, for example, through science and engineering practices, it's going to help students and learners refine a solution to a complex real-world problem based on scientific knowledge, student-generated sources of evidence, prioritized criteria, and trade-off considerations. It's going to promote teamwork and collaboration. Again, inquiry is awesome in that sense, where it's going to give students the opportunity to reflect upon prior knowledge, and then they can base that information off and have meaningful discussions with their peers and the instructor to figure out why certain phenomena are happening. It's going to support differentiated learning styles. As we know, the students sitting in our classrooms have different types of learning styles in which that they learn best. So it's a great way for high-level analytical learners to look at the facts, to look at the data, and then also looking at those students who prefer the more hands-on approach, the kinesthetic learners. Those are the ones that are going to make connections through those hands-on project-based and problem-based learning activities. It's going to help close those learning gaps, especially for historically underdeveloped populations. So again, keeping in mind the correlation between that three-dimensional learning with the science and engineering practices, the cross-cutting concepts, and those disciplinary core ideas. Inquiry techniques can be used in all branches of science, whether you're looking at the physical, earth and space, life sciences, etc. And not to mention, it's going to make the students think. It's going to make them think more so than just having a yes or no, right or wrong answer. It's going to push them to dig deeper. It's going to push them to recollect on that prior knowledge and then push for more questioning, to strive for more, to learn more, to inquire more. Speaking briefly to guided versus open inquiry, experiences that vary in openness are needed to develop the inquiry abilities. So guided inquiry can best focus learning on development of particular science concepts. So what do we want the learners to know? What do we want them to have as the basis of their foundational learning? And then how is that going to help them as they move toward open inquiry? So more open inquiry will afford the best opportunities for cognitive development and scientific reasoning. And again, an example of an SEP. Most scientific knowledge is quite durable, but in principle subject to change based on new evidence and or reinterpretation of existing evidence. So even though we think there might be one concrete answer, solution, or reasoning to any proposed question, students might find the opportunity to question that process, find different ways to collect data, and find other explanations for explaining various phenomena as they develop through the inquiry process. Students should have opportunities to participate in all types of inquiries in their course of their science learning. So, for example, in agricultural science education, a really cool activity that I came across when I was a teacher in the classroom was something that was put out by the University of Florida Chemistry Outreach Program. It's called Fireworks and Milk. I primarily did this with a high school class, but it's a great way to introduce science into agricultural science and also into family and consumer sciences. So the overall gist of it is basically students are testing different surfactant reactions to different types of milk based on fat content. So typically we would use heavy cream, we would use half and half, skim milk, and also 2% milk. And what students would do is they put the samples in 4 different petri dishes and they put 4 different food coloring drops in there. Then they would take the surfactant, typically we would use Dawn dish detergent, and we would use that on a Q-tip or a toothpick, and we'd submerge it very gently into that dairy product. And then students would observe the phenomena, being how the surfactant, the dish detergent, reacted with the fats within the dairy product and how the food coloring reacted to that. And then they would come up for an explanation as to why that was happening, whether it was a hydrophobic reaction or a hydrophilic interaction. And then we discussed kitchen chemistry as far as food science or family and consumer science is concerned. So again, as you can see, there's a little bit of a picture there showing you exactly how the students would process through it. Obviously, this lesson is available to you, but in our SEPs, basically students are going to plan and conduct an investigation individually and collaboratively to produce data to serve as the basis for evidence. And again, they would record, they'd find the different ways to do the different number of trials. Does it depend on where you place the surfactant into the liquid? And they would deduct and deduce reasoning from that. So, summarizing the inquiry checklist for students, we want students to make initial observations. Then we want them to pose or respond to researchable questions. And just a little disclaimer here, if you have students researching, especially on the World Wide Web, I think this is a perfect teachable moment for us to educate our students on how to find viable and valuable and responsible resources online. That way they're actually finding concrete factual information. Students will formulate predictions or cause and effect hypotheses to test these research questions. They're going to plan for procedures that identify relative variables and produce data to test the research questions that they're posing. They'll then use different methods to collect, organize, and display their data. They're going to analyze that data, craft tentative inferences to evaluate predictions or hypotheses. They'll share those ideas, results, and inferences with their groups and peers, and they will provide feedback and potentially validity. If they need to, they'll go back and revise the data and the evaluation of the data and maybe tweak their experiments and questioning. And then they'll reach a formal consensus on answers to the research questions that were asked in the first place.
Okay, so when we talk about the standards, we have to understand that the implementation of these standards is not going to result in change overnight. As older students graduate, younger students will have an increasing level of exposure to this new paradigm. Incremental changes will become increasingly evident until all the students have had exposure to the new science standards K through 12. Now, this changes the way that we think about science. Modifications to the methodology have to include changes from what is this to how could this be done. From is this true or false to how or why is it true or false. From content to a deeper understanding of the broad and connected nature of scientific phenomena. And inevitably, this is going to result in a change in planning and teaching. Now, our academic standards have undergone an evolution. Current traditional content areas are now segregated again from each other. Our former math and science technology standards demonstrated connections between the disciplines. Learning standards are no longer shared disciplines. And today, each set of new learning standards includes other disciplines. Now, technology education is also undergoing change. Although it's become an integral part of every discipline, it also plays a critical role in supporting the standards evolution. However, technology is not synonymous with other disciplines. Technology content organizers have been recently developed that align with the current focus upon how students learn, not what they learn. The use of technology content organizers evolved from the national efforts to identify the most critical areas of the technology essential to the United States economic future in a secure environment. For further information, you can reference that. Now, the program approval process, I'd like to take a few minutes about. You know that approved programs lead to the industry recognized credential or certificate. We also have an opportunity to apply those academic concepts to real-world situations. We want to prepare for industry-based assessments or certifications and the opportunity to earn college credit. We have to include our work-based learning opportunities. And if you look at this carefully, you will notice that the criteria align nicely with the goals of the next generation science standards. Now, how will the New York State Science Standards align with the CTE Program Approval and Reapproval process? The curriculum design actually provides rigorous content, which is non-duplicative and provides the student with a coherent sequential program of study. Whether it's integrated or specialized credit, crosswalks are required. The curriculum is aligned to both state and national learning standards. Our external reviewers have to confirm that the CTE program content includes those credits. And then we also have to abide by the recommendations from that committee. The external review is a committee that's going to address and approve the self-study report. The academic instructors from districts have to, external to the school pursuing the CTE program approval will validate the existing academic curriculum. And then preparation for the external review will need to include the New York State Science Learning Standards alignment. On your CTE State Ed reapproval application in question 12, it states, has a learning standards curriculum crosswalk been completed for this program? In question 13, it asks you to identify which of those standards are aligned. So let's take a look at another methodology that aligns well with NGSS. This includes project-based learning. To ensure full alignment, we will see 5 key considerations for project designers, and that's from the Buck Institute for Education. The first of these are products. So the product should engage, a rigorous combination of reading, writing, listening, and speaking about the topic of investigation. The rubrics should be based on standards, both in terms of the criteria and the wording. And the project should be structured to provide space for inquiry and also include careful scaffolding of the identified standards. Throughout the inquiry process in a project, learning experiences have to be designed to drive students back to the text and encourage them to formulate evidence-based reasoning. Project plans should also include formative assessment throughout, and we want to make sure at key checkpoints during the project. So CTE crosswalks do not always utilize the same format, but project-based learning can help to define the curriculum crosswalks for the field. The next generation science standards include building a culture of inquiry and attention to detail. The science and engineering practices are going to plan on carrying out investigations to answer prior questions or test solutions to problems. That's the K through 2. But then it has to extend through grades 11 through 12 with formulating, refining, and evaluating empirically testable questions and design problems using models and situations. So the key components of project-based learning, we have to emphasize that students explore real-world problems. We want with integrated studies for the teachers to think about the content subjects that can be woven into the project. With student-centered learning, the teachers need to use their expertise in student development to match the content to the needs of those students. And then with real learning, the students are engaged in critical thinking and problem-solving activities. So let's take a look of an example and walk you through how this will align with the standards. This example is a health and safety inspection race. So what we do at the beginning of the year is we ask students to participate in a team competition. We have 2 parts to this. In part 1, we ask students to respond to potential chemical and physical hazards related to a safety data sheet. In part 2, we ask students to role play as an OSHA inspector. The driving question would be, how do technicians maintain safety in a workplace environment? And this involves both chemical and physical safety. So to preface the project, we start a short presentation that introduces students to the reason for safety legislation known as the Right to Know Act. In the Right to Know Act, Congress enacted provisions that would help increase the public knowledge and access to information on chemicals at individual facilities, their uses and releases into the environment. Now, students are surprised to discover that the incident actually occurred in Bhopal, India in 1984, but it was with an American chemical company. The legislation was passed in 1986 in response to concerns regarding the environmental and safety hazards posed by the storage and handling of toxic chemicals. Now, the concerns were actually triggered by the disaster in Bhopal, India, in which hundreds of thousands of people suffered death or serious injury when there was an accidental release of methyl isocyanate. This is used to make the pesticide 7. So after students discuss the event and the U.S. government response, then they author an answer to the question, what is the most important purpose of the federal legislation commonly known as the Right to Know law? Then we move on to the health and safety inspection race. So teams are asked to find the section that explains whether the substance is carcinogenic, identify the extinguishing media, identify emergency procedures, take a look for the personal protective clothing that is required, and then what is the flash point of the substance. As they're doing this, we take a look at the second part, which is going to involve our Occupational Safety and Health Association. And what we want to do for this is where teams have to report to the timer to issue a start time. They find a station in the shop where many hazards are set up. They will record the hazard, and then they must identify a solution that is going to actually take care of the hazard. The teacher has to review and approve, their solutions before they get a stopwatch end time. So let's take a look at what categories of alignment to the NGSS are. We model what scientists do. So this is in a real-world context, and it has a role play. For our cross-cutting concepts, we have interdisciplinary context, we have global connections, we include U.S. history connections. We have multiple science disciplines, so we involve chemistry and physics and the environment. A way that we might actually align this in one format, this is a potential crosswalk. If our approach during external review is more focused upon the curriculum crosswalk and less focused upon the lessons and activities, then more detail will be needed in the crosswalk. So let's take a look at what this would look like for some of our science integration programs. In the top, you'll see that I gave you an example for the shop safety, where our core ideas would involve matter and interactions, motion and stability. Our science and engineering practices would be analyzing and interpreting data. Our cross-cutting concepts would be cause and effect. I gave you a second example there for a construction trades example in weatherization, where our core idea would be predominantly energy. Our practices would be analyzing and interpreting data in addition to planning and carrying out investigations. And then our cross-cutting concepts, again, would be cause and effect. Now, what if our approach was actually more focused during our external review on lessons and activities, and less focused is going to be placed on the curriculum crosswalk? Then we can focus on our performance expectations. So how this would change is we would say, here is our unit on shop safety. Our content includes the safety data sheets, our OSHA inspections, and fire safety. Our performance expectations would be chemical reactions, stability and change, where much of the science deals with constructing explanations of how things change and how they remain stable. If I took a weatherization, energy conservation perspective, we could talk about vapor barriers and how water damages homes. And then that would include performance expectations for energy, the conservation of energy and energy transfer, where uncontrolled systems always evolve towards more stable states and towards more uniform energy distribution. And also human sustainability, to evaluate competing design solutions to real-world problem based on scientific ideas, principles, evidence, and argument. Now, curriculum alignment to math and ELA. Below each foundation box in the Next Generation Science Standards, you will also find something called a connections box. And where you see the connections box, it will cite the Math and English Common Core State Standards that align with the 3 dimensions of learning for that performance expectation. In summary, the New York State Science Learning Standards have changed the framework to focus upon the process of learning instead of the content. CTE has always prioritized the learning process through project and problem-based learning and inquiry-based learning. Curriculum alignment is now going to model these processes inherent in learning the content. Thank you very much for participating, and we would like to invite you to ask questions.
All right, great, thank you. There's no questions right now, so let's give attendees about maybe a minute, and if nothing comes in, we'll wrap up. All right, and we do have one question. What are the minimum requirements for a New York State crosswalk for reapproval/approval?
At a minimum, we have to include our performance expectations. So those are the ones that are the key content identifiers for the themes related to the unit of study.
Okay, thank you. All right, and we have one more. How can I merge my food science standards with the science standards?
Is that from a culinary arts perspective, or?
Yes, culinary arts.
Okay, so let me take an example. So I do a leavening experiment where we use different combinations of leavening agents for a quick burn. And one of the things that we would do is we would then have a taste test as a result, and then we would evaluate the data from that. So that's one example.
Okay, thank you. All right, it doesn't seem like we have any more questions. So Mike or Hillary, is there anything else you'd like to add before we end?
Nope, just thank you everyone for participating today. We hope this was beneficial to you.
Please contact us if you have any further questions.
Okay, thank you. So on behalf of the Technical Assistance Center, thank you to Mike and Hillary for your presentation, and thank you to those who attended. And as a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be posted on nysctecenter.org within 72 hours.